My name is Austin Currie. I'm candidate number 1124. I'm here to propose a political solution to fentanyl-related deaths. So first, we're going to start with this graph. As you can see, it is a national drug-involved overdose deaths in America. You see it has doubled since 2015. The rate of increase of these deaths has also increased. It's very unprecedented, which is very interesting, because when you look at this graph, you can see heroin, antidepressants, a lot of these other drugs are either going down or stagnating, while synthetic opioids are increasing greatly. And when the CDC and the DEA of America are talking synthetic opioids, they're primarily talking about fentanyl. So what that means is that people are dying of fentanyl so much that this graph is becoming so high that it's unprecedented. And what's even more unprecedented about that is that the drug isn't necessarily completely sourced in America. It seems to be coming from China with precursor chemicals. These precursor chemicals are then being sent to other countries to be synthesized and then sent to America afterward. The age of death is also young and getting younger, as teenagers aren't necessarily taking fentanyl as they would heroin or some other hard drug, but they are taking other drugs which are laced with fentanyl, and that's a very hard thing to trace, and that's the primary bulk of these deaths are fentanyl lacing other substances. That could be marijuana, crack, meth, heroin, even water. So when we look locally, North Carolina, the state we're in the United States, has reported a 22% increase in fentanyl deaths. That is 4,050 deaths out of the national 70,601 in 2021. And when you look at that, that's a very interesting thing, because it's supposed to be coming through the border right here and the West Coast, where China is over here. But you see the East Coast having a lot of trouble. Colorado and Oklahoma are also expressing crisis states, making a lot of legislation when it comes to fentanyl. And when you look internationally, you can see this trade we were talking about between China, Mexico, and the United States, and Canada and India. You see these precursor chemicals are flowing across the Pacific Ocean. And what that means is, although all countries are suffering from fentanyl deaths, of course America is the most suffering, but all countries are suffering from fentanyl deaths, but it also means that the drug is moving between international borders and across the Pacific Ocean, which is incredibly unprecedented. You can see a lot of the countries that are in this trade, the three over here, and of course China and India over there, are some of the largest fentanyl death-related countries. So what we're going to look at is America producing a House Judiciary report with a lot of interviews when it comes to how the country with the most fentanyl deaths is going to deal with it politically. So we can talk about criminalization, and we can talk about the way you want to address it policy-wise. So we have Dr. Singer here, who in this House Judiciary report I read, talks about the iron law of prohibition. When you criminalize a drug, what you're doing is you're making it so that the next drug is going to come along and harder to criminalize. It's going to be smaller, it's going to be more potent, it's going to be easier to transport, it's going to be harder to track. That is what fentanyl is. It is a result of the supposed iron law of prohibition. It also may have a medical use. So this specific House report was going to politically recognize, the law from the House report was going to recognize fentanyl as a substance that had no medical use and a high potential for abuse. And fentanyl, at the very least, is being used in executions, which isn't necessarily a medical use. But things like LSD have been scheduled like fentanyl with no medical use. Of course, they have come out on top. He mentions xylazone as a something that might come after fentanyl if it were to be criminalized. He talks about harm reduction facilities, which aren't necessarily encouraging the use of drugs, but normalizes it in the sense that a government can oversee a person doing hard drugs, so it's sort of on the record, above level, and that means fentanyl doesn't get into heroin because they are both being watched. Derek Maltz is sort of the opposite. He was high up in the DEA for the longest time. I believe he left as a result of this fentanyl crisis. He was dealing with narco-terrorism in the Americas, and he asserts that people don't want to take fentanyl. Of course, as we've mentioned, most of these deaths are accidental in a sense when it comes to fentanyl, and that means that laws criminalization, the iron law of prohibition, do not necessarily apply. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. That means, as opposed to plant-based opioids, they are much easier to produce. You can be produced in a lab. They're much harder to track. Derek Maltz is a person that believes that the government does not get involved enough when it comes to this fentanyl crisis in terms of education, in terms of awareness, in terms of policy making, and so he calls for border control. It's very interesting because the House Judiciary report, when it comes to border control, you see Democrats talking about fentanyl as coming through the registered checkpoints in our southern border of the United States or through ports on the east and the west coast. Republicans see it as coming through holes in the border and through ports in places that you cannot necessarily register a person coming in. Derek Maltz more aligns with the Republican viewpoint. I do believe if there was a person that was to know, it would be Derek Maltz, who was high up in the DEA, dealing with narco-terrorism, investigating things like this, making something similar to those maps that we saw earlier between China, India, Canada, United States, and Mexico. So I do believe border control is a good means of stopping fentanyl. Derek Maltz believes it is, and when you look at that, the problem is when it comes to bipartisan efforts like that, the facts are being obscured. We don't know where this fentanyl is coming from because both parties have a completely different full narrative that conflicts with each other. And so if we were able to sit down and come up with the same basis, we'd first know, and we'd also be able to sort of treat fentanyl as a separate issue away from the war in Ukraine, the budgeting issues, the criminalization at the border. When it comes to American issues, they're being wrapped up in fentanyl. It's not becoming an independent thing. For criminalization, it's a very unprecedented thing, as we've mentioned. It's a foreign drug, and people don't take it purposefully. That means you can't really criminalize the user, and it's very hard to find the producer. So criminalization isn't going to give us the effect that I believe we're seeking. As for our other perspectives, we have technology. Another person in my group mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy. I believe that's a good idea. It's just therapy to sort of remove addictive habits from people. It's not criminal. It has a lot to do with those sort of harm reduction facilities, keeping things above the board as opposed to punishing them. And the problem is people that don't want to take fentanyl, of course. And also, fentanyl can get into something non-addictive, like marijuana, something that's not a drug, like a water cooler. And cognitive behavioral therapy would not be able to reach these victims before they were to overdose. Narcan reverses the effects of an overdose. Police have been carrying it around, so when they see a person overdosing, they can cure them. And of course, that stops the death, and that reduces the deaths, and I very much appreciate it because of that, but it does not solve the problem. And when it comes to police funding, when it comes to making sure they can arrive on the scene fast enough, that's a line that we're drawing that's very close to criminalization, which I do not necessarily appreciate. And Dr. Singer also talks about the crack epidemic in the 80s nationally, where we sort of did incarcerate our way through the problem, is what he says, and it didn't necessarily work out. I believe a better economic solution would be to sort of economically encourage China to not produce these precursor chemicals. That is something that has happened, that is something that has worked, and the current Biden administration is working on it. That is the end of my presentation, and that's the end of my presentation.